There was a gas station on the outskirts of the city, the kind that seemed not to have had customers in years. People drove by without paying attention, especially at night, when the flickering neon light barely illuminated the area. It was the type of place you wouldn't want to stop at unless you were desperate. It was 2:34 in the morning when Daniel realized his tank was empty. He cursed under his breath. His GPS indicated the nearest service station was 30 kilometers away, but there was no way he'd make it. As if reading his mind, a faded sign for an old, forgotten station appeared in the distance, surrounded by fields of nothing. He could barely make out the name of the station, Glenwood Gas, or what was left of it, as half of the letters had long fallen off. The station was as silent as a tomb. The windows were dark, cracked in some places, and covered in grime. The gas pumps were old, the kind where you had to pull a lever before the numbers started spinning wildly. Daniel felt uneasy, but he had no choice. He was low on fuel and there was nowhere else to go. He parked next to the pump and got out of the car. The silence enveloped him as he unscrewed the gas cap. He looked toward the dark window of the station shop and saw a figure moving inside. Daniel froze for a moment, then relaxed. It was probably just the attendant. Maybe the guy had fallen asleep behind the counter. After filling the tank, Daniel headed inside to pay. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the sound startling in the almost eerie silence. The air inside was thick and stale. The shelves were half empty, filled with dusty cans and faded bags of chips. It seemed like no one had set foot there in years, yet the faint smell of tobacco and cheap coffee hung in the air, as if someone had just left. "Hello?" Daniel said, approaching the counter. There was no response. He noticed an old-fashioned bell on the counter and rang it once. The sound stretched unnaturally, resonating in his ears longer than it should have. Then, something behind the counter moved. A man slowly rose from a crouched position, his face emerging from the shadows. His skin was wrinkled, and his eyes watched Daniel with a strange calm, as if he knew something Daniel didn't. Daniel stepped back involuntarily. "Need anything?" the man asked in a low, raspy voice, as if made from crushed gravel underfoot. "Just, I filled the tank outside. I need to pay," Daniel said, extending his card. The man looked at the card, then at Daniel's face as if he were trying to remember how to interact with people. Slowly, the man reached out, his hand trembling slightly, but not from age. "There was something else. You know," the man said, his lips curling into a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Most people don't stop by here after dark." Daniel laughed nervously. "Well, I didn't have much of a choice. I almost ran out of gas." The man didn't respond. He swiped the card, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. There was something unsettling in his gaze, as if he were studying, evaluating, or waiting for something. When the card machine beeped, the man handed the card back, but his hand lingered a moment too long. "I'd be careful if I were you," the man said in a low voice, his tone barely a whisper now. "Careful of what?" Daniel asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Some people don't have good intentions on this road, especially at night. You shouldn't stop for anyone." Daniel frowned, not entirely understanding what the man meant, but a sense of danger began to form in his stomach. "Thanks for the advice," he said, putting away his card and turning towards the door. As he pushed it open, the man's voice followed him. "Don't stop for anyone, no matter what." The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off what the man was about to say. Daniel hurried back to his car, his heart pounding. Now the gas station seemed even more sinister, as if it were watching him. As he sat in the driver's seat, he still felt the man's eyes on his back. He drove away quickly, grateful to be leaving that place behind. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark. The only light came from his headlights, cutting through the total darkness. He turned on the radio to try and calm his nerves, but all he heard was static, no matter which station he tuned to. Eventually, he gave up, letting the silence fill the car. Minutes passed, and Daniel began to relax, telling himself it had just been a strange encounter. But then, he saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. As he got closer, the figure waved, stepping into the beam of the headlights. It was a woman, with torn clothing, her hair falling in messy strands over her face. She looked hurt, desperate. Despite every instinct screaming in his head, Daniel slowed down. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she had been in an accident. He rolled down the window, his voice tense with doubt. "Are you okay?" The woman lifted her head, and before she could respond, Daniel's eyes locked onto something else. There was another man beyond the woman, hidden among the trees. Panic hit Daniel hard. The warning from the man at the gas station echoed in his head. He hit the gas pedal without saying a word, the tires screeching as he sped off. In the rearview mirror, he saw the woman and the man emerge from the woods, watching him as he drove away, their shadows disappearing into the darkness. His heart pounded as he pressed the pedal harder, trying to put as much distance as possible between him and those strangers. The road seemed endless. Every shadow, every flash in the darkness made his pulse race. The danger had been real, and he had been one step away from falling into a trap. Finally, when the city lights appeared in the distance, Daniel let out a sigh of relief. He was safe, but the warning from the man still echoed in his mind. Clara was driving down a lonely highway past midnight when her car started to sputter and finally stalled. She cursed under her breath as she veered off to the side of the road. Of course, her phone had no signal, and the nearest town was about 50 kilometers away. The only visible light in the darkness was a flickering sign far off in the distance. El Paraíso service station. The place didn't look promising. It was the kind of station you would avoid, especially at night. But Clara had no other option. The cold, heavy air surrounded her as she walked quickly, flashlight in hand. Up close, the building looked even more rundown. The windows were covered in grime, the paint was peeling, and one of the letters on the sign dangled precariously in the wind. She pushed open the door, which creaked loudly. Inside, the place was deserted. The shelves were filled with products, but everything looked old and neglected, as if no one had set foot inside for years. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. "Hello?" Clara called out, but only the buzz of an old refrigerator responded. She walked towards the counter, noticing a bell on it. She rang it, and the sound echoed unnaturally loudly in the empty space. For a moment, nothing happened, but then she heard slow footsteps approaching from the back. The door behind the counter opened with a creak, and a man appeared. He was tall and thin, with a pale, haggard face as if he hadn't slept in days. His gaze traveled up and down, and though he smiled, his eyes reflected a dangerous coldness. "Do you need help?" he asked in a raspy voice. "My car broke down," Clara said, trying to stay calm. "I need to call a tow truck." The man said nothing at first. After what felt like an eternity, he slid an old phone across the counter. Clara picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. "It doesn't work," she said, feeling a knot forming in her stomach. The man smiled, but it was a sinister smile, like he knew something she didn't. "Sometimes it takes a while," he responded. Clara started to feel uncomfortable. Something about this place and the man felt wrong. Trying to keep her composure, she asked, "Is there a bathroom?" The man pointed outside. "Out back, the door is open," he said without losing that unsettling smile. Clara nodded and hurried outside. As she rounded the corner, she noticed something strange, fresh footprints on the ground leading into the woods. They weren't normal footprints. They were too large and spaced out as if someone had been running. Fear started creeping in, but she needed a moment to think. She opened the bathroom door and froze. The walls were covered in scratched messages. Many of them were names, but one warning was repeated over and over. "Don't trust the guy at the station, run." Terror hit her full force. She slammed the door shut and turned to run back to her car, but as she rounded the corner, the man was there, watching her with that same eerie smile. "Looking for something?" he asked calmly as he advanced slowly towards her. Clara began to back away, but he moved quickly, grabbing her arm. His strength was terrifying, and before she could react, he dragged her back inside the station. With a shove, he pushed her against the counter, and as the lights flickered, she saw something terrifying. Through the station's windows, several figures were approaching from the woods, moving among the shadows. "You should have kept driving," the man whispered, his tone mocking. "Now you can't escape." Clara understood immediately. She wasn't alone. Those figures weren't friendly, and the man who had her trapped was worse than she had imagined. With her heart racing, she knew that if she didn't act fast, she wouldn't live to tell what was happening. Sensing a brief moment of distraction in the man, Clara managed to break free and run towards the door, but her car was still disabled. Panic consumed her as she was chased. The sound of quick footsteps behind her grew louder, and the shadows seemed to swallow her. In one last effort, she ran into the woods, not caring about the danger she might face there. She didn't look back, knowing that if she did, what she would see would be her end. Clara ran as fast as her legs would carry her, but the fear weighed more than the exhaustion. She felt branches scratching her skin and the cold wind wrapped around her. The sounds of her pursuers intensified. The stomping and cracking of dry branches behind her were relentless. She knew she didn't have much time. It wasn't just the man from the station. There were more people chasing her, probably the hitmen the man had called hiding in the woods. Every step took her deeper into the forest, and although she knew getting lost in that maze of trees could be fatal, stopping meant certain death. She could feel the presence of her pursuers just meters away, moving with the precision and stealth of expert hunters. Suddenly, Clara tripped on a protruding root and fell flat on the ground. The impact left her dazed, her hands and knees scraped. She quickly turned, expecting to see one of them on top of her, but to her surprise, the forest was silent. The only sound she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart, which seemed to hammer in her ears. She got up as best as she could, forcing herself to move forward. She knew they had to be close. There was no way they had abandoned the chase. As she moved, the forest grew denser and darker, and the moon barely filtered through the treetops. Clara heard a noise to her left, a whisper that chilled her blood. She hid behind a thick tree, trying to calm her breathing while she peered through the shadows. She saw the figure of one of them passing just a few meters away. It was one of the hitmen, holding a flashlight turned off in one hand and a machete hanging from his belt. The man stopped and looked around as if sniffing the air, searching for his prey. Clara held her breath, praying silently not to be discovered. Her mind raced. She couldn't stay there forever. She had to find a way to escape, but how? She was unarmed and out of options. Suddenly, the hitman turned around, apparently deciding to search in another direction. Clara seized the moment and began to move slowly, slipping between the trees without making a sound. She didn't know where she was going, she only knew she had to get as far away from them as possible. As she moved forward, she heard a branch snap to her right. Another hitman was close. Clara tensed, paralyzed by terror. Then, without warning, she launched herself running again. She had no other choice. It was now or never. The sound of the hitmen resumed behind her. This time, they were at full speed, no longer bothering to be silent. The branches broke as they passed, their steps quick and determined. Clara could barely stay upright. Exhaustion and fear were weakening her. Each breath was painful, each step torture. Finally, in the distance, through the darkness of the forest, she saw a faint light. It was a beacon of hope. Without thinking, she headed towards the light, her legs trembling but determined to keep going. As she got closer, she saw the light came from a small cabin hidden among the trees. The cabin looked old but still standing, with a dim lamp on the front porch. Without hesitation, Clara climbed the 3 wooden steps and banged on the door desperately. "Please help," she shouted between gasps, looking towards the forest, expecting to see her pursuers emerge at any moment. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder. "Please let me in, they're chasing me." The door finally opened, and an older man with a calm but serious expression appeared in the doorway. His eyes observed her with curiosity and suspicion. "What's happening?" he asked in a deep voice. Clara could barely speak, gasping and trembling with fear. "They're following me. Hitmen. Please, I need to hide." The man frowned, studying her closely, but before he could say anything else, a noise from the forest alerted him. He looked into the shadows as if he knew exactly what was coming. The older man looked at her again, this time with more urgency. "Come in, quickly," he whispered as he glanced towards the dark forest. Clara didn't hesitate for a second and crossed the threshold, feeling a slight relief at being inside the cabin. The man quickly shut the door behind her and locked it with precision. The interior of the cabin was lit by an oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Despite the humble nature of the place, there was something comforting in the simplicity of the cabin, like she was safe for the first time in hours. "What happened?" the man asked as he walked towards a window, pulling back a curtain to look outside. "Who are those men?" Clara collapsed into a nearby chair, still breathing heavily, trying to find the right words between the confusion and panic. "My car, it broke down at a gas station," she said between gasps. "The man there, something was wrong with him. Then he chased me. He wasn't alone. There were more. I don't know who they are, but they're hunting me." The man nodded silently as if he had expected something like this. He walked back to the table and sat in front of Clara, his dark eyes fixed on her. "That place, it's not what it seems," he said in a low voice. "I've heard stories, people who pass by that gas station and never return. Men like those aren't just thugs. They're hunting something or someone, and they won't stop until they get it." Clara looked at him, terrified but curious. "How do you know?" The man diverted his gaze back to the window as if recalling something from his own past. "I've lived in these woods long enough to know the shadows that inhabit them," he murmured. "They aren't the first to show up around here looking for blood." Just then a noise from outside broke the tense calm. Clara jumped to her feet, her heart pounding again in her chest. The man signaled for her to stay quiet. The two remained motionless, listening to the sounds of the hitmen slowly approaching the cabin. She could hear their steps on the fallen leaves, their low, murmuring voices. "They're here," Clara whispered, a lump forming in her throat. The man headed to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened the door and pulled out an old but well-kept shotgun. He loaded it with precision, his movements quick and sure. "We're going to have to outsmart them if we want to get out of this," he said as he looked at Clara. "This isn't the first time I've faced men like these. But now there are two of us, and that gives us a small advantage." Clara nodded, feeling a spark of hope, though fear still pounded in her chest. The man handed her a small knife, the only weapon available for her. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing," he said. "Hide in that small pantry in the back. If anything goes wrong, run into the woods and don't look back." Clara nodded and ran to the pantry, closing the door behind her, shrouded in darkness. Her breathing was slow and heavy, trying to calm herself, as she listened to the footsteps getting closer. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the murmurs of the men outside. The man remained in the main room, his body tense, ready for what was to come. Then a loud knock shook the cabin door. One of the hitmen, with a harsh and challenging voice, spoke from outside. "We know she's in there," he said mockingly. "There's no point hiding her. If you give her up now, we'll leave you alone. But if you resist, well, you don't want to know what we'll do." The man gritted his teeth, his gaze fixed on the door. Clara from the pantry felt her heart racing even more. There was no way those men would leave without causing harm. "I have nothing of interest to you," the man replied calmly, though his voice had a dangerous edge. The hitmen didn't respond, but the sound of boots on the wooden porch grew louder. A few seconds later, the door shook violently as they tried to force it open. Clara held her breath as she listened to the door creak, about to give way. The tension was unbearable. The hitmen were inside, and soon they would discover where she was hiding. The first shot shattered the silence with a deafening explosion. The man fired his shotgun at the door as it finally gave way, and the hitmen scattered momentarily, surprised by the resistance. But the moment of advantage was brief. Clara heard the shouts and blows from the pantry, the sound of chaos filling the cabin. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. Clara knew that if she didn't move, they would soon find her. The noises of the fight outside were terrifying. Gunshots, shouts, the crunch of furniture being overturned. Her mind struggled to find a way out, but all she could think of was escaping. Taking a deep breath, she opened the pantry door just enough to peek out. She saw the older man wrestling with one of the hitmen, the shotgun on the floor out of his reach. Another hitman was at the back of the room, slowly moving towards the direction of the pantry, holding a knife in his hand. The sound of his heavy breathing and the crunch of his boots on the wooden floor quickened her pulse. There wasn't much time. With the knife in hand, Clara quietly slipped out of the pantry and headed for the nearest window, hoping the hitman wouldn't see her. But when she was halfway across, the man with the knife spotted her. "There she is," he shouted, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Without thinking, Clara ran towards the window and with a desperate swing, smashed the glass with the knife. Shards fell to the ground, but she didn't hesitate. She jumped through the broken frame, feeling the sharp edges tear at her jacket. But it didn't matter. She hit the ground hard, pain radiating through her knees and elbows, but she had to keep moving. She got up as best she could and started running towards the forest. Behind her, she heard the hitman's shouts. She could feel the threat, the speed with which he was closing in. But Clara kept running, ignoring the pain and fear that wrapped around her. The forest welcomed her with its overwhelming darkness, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to put distance between herself and those men. The trees closed in around her, the terrain growing more difficult with each step. Her breathing became increasingly heavy, but she couldn't stop. The hitmen were still close. Their voices echoed behind her as they hunted her like an animal. "You have nowhere to run!" one of them shouted, his guttural voice resonating in the darkness. Clara ignored his words, her body driven by adrenaline and fear. She ran as fast as she could, dodging low branches and fallen logs, but she knew she couldn't keep going for much longer. Suddenly a shot rang out behind her, followed by a scream. Clara stopped, gasping, and looked back. The older man had come out of the cabin, and despite being wounded, he had managed to take down one of the hitmen with his shotgun. But there was still one more, and the older man didn't have much strength left. The remaining hitman was closing in quickly, and Clara saw the weapon in his hand. "Run!" the man shouted from a distance as he aimed his shotgun again. Clara knew she couldn't do much to help, but she couldn't leave the man alone either. Making a quick decision, she ran to the side, hiding among the trees as she watched the hitman move in her direction. Her heart pounded, her thoughts racing. From her hiding spot, Clara heard the echo of another shot. This time it was closer, more direct, and she saw the hitman's body fall heavily to the ground. It was over. She stood there, motionless for a moment, her mind trying to process what had just happened. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the trees whispering in the wind. When she finally stepped out of her hiding spot, the older man approached slowly, limping slightly. Their eyes met, and he nodded with a serious expression, though his face showed the exhaustion of the battle. "We need to get out of here," he said with a raspy voice. "More will come soon. These men weren't alone." Clara nodded, her body still trembling from adrenaline and fear. Without saying another word, the two began walking together into the forest, knowing they couldn't stay there much longer. The darkness enveloped them, but for now they were safe. The rain poured down in torrents, and the windshield wipers could barely keep up. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes straining to see through the dense curtain of water. The GPS had stopped working kilometers ago, leaving him guessing which turn to take on the winding country roads. He was in the middle of nowhere, and the fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty. Just as he started to panic, he saw a faint glow through the downpour. A gas station. He felt relieved, but the feeling was short-lived. As he got closer, the place looked old, as if it had been forgotten by time. The sign above the building simply said, "Station," with no indication of a brand, and the windows were covered with a layer of grime. The gas pumps were relics, rusty and forgotten, as if they hadn't been used in decades, but there was light inside. Lucas hesitated. Something about the place made him uneasy, but he didn't have the luxury of being picky. The rain was coming down harder now, and he was almost out of fuel. He parked under the canopy, grabbed his wallet, and hurried toward the door, opening it with a loud creak. The interior of the store was dimly lit, with the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. The shelves were stocked with outdated products, canned food with labels he didn't recognize, soda brands he'd never seen, and snack boxes covered in dust. It felt like he was stepping into another era, but not in a nostalgic way. More like the place had been frozen in time. Behind the counter stood a woman. Something about her made him uncomfortable right away. She was tall and thin, with pale skin, and her eyes seemed to shine under the dim light. Her expression was inscrutable, her lips unmoving, as if she were neither happy nor threatening. She was just there, watching him. "Hello," Lucas said, suddenly feeling awkward in the oppressive silence. "I almost ran out of fuel. Do I pay here first, or—" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Lucas cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. "Do the pumps still work?" he asked, his voice a bit lower this time. After an uncomfortably long pause, the woman slowly raised a hand and pointed to the far end of the station, where there was a second set of pumps he hadn't noticed before. They were even older than the ones near the entrance, like relics from the 1950s. "Oh, thanks," murmured Lucas, turning and heading toward the door. He felt the woman's eyes on his back as he walked, the hairs on his neck standing up. Outside, the rain had eased a bit, but the air was thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. Lucas walked toward the old pumps, the crunch of gravel under his feet, the only sound in the unsettling silence. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The price per liter was absurdly low, as if it hadn't been updated in 50 years. But he wasn't going to complain. He reached for the hose to start filling the tank, but his hand froze halfway. The handle was covered in something dark and sticky, maybe oil or some kind of grease. He wiped his hand on his pants, frowning. Suddenly, the pump activated on its own, the fuel dripping slowly from the nozzle as if the pump were breathing. Lucas stepped back, his heart racing. His instinct told him to leave, but he was stranded in the middle of nowhere. He needed the fuel. Swallowing his discomfort, he placed the nozzle in the tank and let it fill, watching as the ancient numbers on the pump slowly spun. Then he heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from behind the station. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, but the rain made it hard to see much. He squinted into the darkness but saw nothing beyond the outline of the building against the night sky. The tapping continued, growing louder. Against his better judgment, Lucas left the car and started walking toward the source of the sound. Around the corner of the building, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing just beyond the edge of the station's light, was a man. He was tall and thin, his clothes dirty and tattered, and he held a heavy object in his hand, a hammer. His face was partially obscured by an old cap, but what little was visible showed deep scars. He was hammering a board, but when Lucas appeared, he stopped immediately. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. His brain screamed for him to turn around, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at the man, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Slowly, the man lifted his head toward him, showing a crooked smile. His eyes were dark, devoid of humanity. Lucas took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The man took a step forward. Lucas stumbled, nearly falling as he backed away, his eyes locked on the figure. The man continued to follow, slowly raising the hammer as if preparing to use it. Lucas turned and ran. He ran back to the car, struggling with the hose, yanking it out, spilling fuel on the wet ground. He hastily returned it to the pump and jumped into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the station and the surrounding road, but the man had vanished. He looked around, his heart still racing, but there was no sign of him. Just the empty lot, the rain, and the flickering lights of the station. For a brief moment, he thought maybe he had imagined it, that maybe the stress of the night and the solitude were playing tricks on him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The man stood just outside the passenger window, mere centimeters from the car, hammer raised. The glass fogged where his fingers touched, leaving long streaks that trailed down. Lucas screamed, putting the car in gear and speeding out of the lot. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as he accelerated. He didn't stop, nor did he look back, his heart pounding as the gas station faded into the distance behind him. But the memory of the figure and the sound of that rhythmic hammering haunted him long after he had left the place. The rain was pouring as Elena drove along the lonely road, her windshield wipers barely managing to keep the view clear. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, and the fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty. The road wound through a desolate landscape, with no signs of life in sight. Just when the fear of getting stranded began to set in, she saw a faint glow in the distance, a gas station sign. She felt relieved when she saw the sign for Garcia's Gas, although the station itself didn't look like much. It was a small, old structure with faded paint and a flickering neon sign. Despite the strangeness of the place, she had no other choice. She parked next to one of the pumps and quickly got out into the rain, pulling the hood of her jacket up for protection. The pumps were some of the oldest she had ever seen, rusty and with a manual system she didn't recognize. The rain hammered against the station roof as Elena filled the tank, glancing toward the store. The windows were dirty, but she could make out the silhouette of someone moving inside. When she finished filling up, she decided to go inside to pay and maybe buy something to eat. The door of the store creaked as it opened, and a rusty bell tinkled as she entered. The interior was dark and cold, with half-empty shelves and products that seemed to have been there for decades. The place smelled of mold and something metallic. "Hello?" Elena called out, her voice echoing off the walls of the silent place. Suddenly, from the back of the store, a man appeared. He was tall and thin, with a face covered in scars and unkempt hair. His eyes were dark, empty, and a twisted smile appeared on his face. "Can I help you?" he asked in a rough, monotonous voice. Elena felt a chill run down her spine but forced a smile as she approached the counter. "I just want to pay for the fuel and maybe a bottle of water," she said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The man nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off her. His gaze followed Elena's every movement with an unsettling intensity. She handed over the money, trying to stay calm as the man slid the bills into the register. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," the man suddenly said, his tone barely a whisper. Elena looked up, surprised. "Why?" she asked, feeling the tension in the air grow. "This is a dangerous place after dark," the man replied with an even stranger smile. Elena tried to laugh, though her voice sounded tense. "Well, I'll be leaving soon." The man didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her for what felt like an eternity before adding, "If I were you, I wouldn't stop for anyone on the road. You never know who might be out there, waiting." Elena felt a knot form in her stomach. The sensation that something was terribly wrong completely took over. She hurried to the door, but just as she pushed it open, the man spoke again. "Be careful. They come out at night." Without looking back, Elena ran out into the rain, her heart pounding. She quickly got into the car and started the engine. As she pulled away from the gas station, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man watching her from the store. But the store was no longer lit. It was as if it had vanished into the darkness. The road ahead of her was a tunnel of shadows, lit only by the car's headlights. The sound of the rain was the only thing breaking the silence. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it had just been a strange encounter. But then, in the distance, she saw a figure. It looked like a person standing at the edge of the road, waving. Her heart stopped for a second. She remembered the man's words at the gas station, "Don't stop for anyone." Elena gripped the steering wheel tightly. The figure kept getting closer as her car slid through the rain. She could see more clearly now. It was a woman, her clothes soaked and torn, her hair hanging over her face. Against every instinct, Elena slowed down, thinking that maybe the woman was hurt or in danger. But something didn't feel right. When she was close enough, she lowered the window just a few centimeters. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman slowly lifted her head, and Elena saw something that made her blood freeze. Her eyes were completely black, empty, and a twisted smile spread across her face. Before she could react, the woman lunged at the car, slamming her hand against the window with inhuman strength. Elena screamed and pressed the accelerator, the tires skidding on the wet pavement as she sped away. Through the rearview mirror, she saw the woman standing on the road, watching her with that same terrifying smile. Elena kept driving, her heart racing until the gas station and the strange figure were far behind. But the sense of danger didn't disappear. The shadows on the sides of the road seemed to move, as if something or someone was following her, lurking in the darkness. The sound of the rain now mixed with another sound, a soft, constant tapping. Elena tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or the rain hitting the car, until she heard it again. This time, louder. A knock, rhythmic, coming from the roof of the car. Elena bit her lip, her breathing quickening. It couldn't be real. It was just her mind playing tricks on her, an echo of the fear she still felt. But the sound continued. Tap, tap. Finally, she gathered the courage to look in the rearview mirror. And there it was. The same woman she had seen on the road, crouched on the roof of the car with that same grotesque smile, tapping softly on the glass. The last thing she saw was her smile before everything went dark. Martine was driving on a secondary road, trying to avoid highway traffic. The shortcut seemed like a good idea at first, but as the minutes passed, the road became narrower and more isolated. The tall, dark trees surrounded him as if they were closing in. The fuel gauge flashed, indicating that he would soon run out of fuel. Desperation started to set in. Just when he was beginning to think he would have to stop and wait, he saw a faint glow in the distance. A gas station appeared among the trees with an old neon sign barely lighting the place. The sign read Estación El Paraíso, but the ruined state of the place didn't give him any confidence. However, he had no other choice. The tank was almost empty. Martine parked his car next to the only rusty pump, the engine coughing as if it knew it wouldn't last much longer. He got out of the car and the cold air hit his face, giving him an uncomfortable feeling. The place was surrounded by absolute silence, something that immediately put him on alert. He lifted the pump nozzle, noticing it was old, and began to fill the tank. While he was doing that, he looked toward the station store. Through the dusty windows, he could see a shadow moving behind the counter. He felt even more uncomfortable, but he decided he had to pay for the fuel before leaving quickly. He entered the store. The bell on the door rang loudly in the silence, and Martin felt that something was wrong. The shelves were half empty, with products that seemed to have been there for decades. Behind the counter, a man with a somber expression watched him. The man was tall, with an unreadable expression. His skin looked weathered and his clothes were dirty. "How much for the fuel?" Martin asked, trying to sound casual. The man stared at him for a long moment before answering in a slow, gravelly voice. €20, he said, leaning over the counter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Martin quickly pulled out the money. He felt that something was wrong and wanted to leave as fast as possible. But just as he was about to hand over the bill, the man spoke again, this time in a low tone. "You shouldn't be around here at this hour." Martin's stomach twisted. He looked into the man's eyes, and although he tried not to seem nervous, the comment threw him off. "I'm just passing through. I'll be leaving right away." The man handed him the change without saying anything else, but just as Martin was turning to leave, the man added, "Be careful on the road. You're not alone." Martin felt a chill run down his spine. He quickened his pace toward the door and left the store, but when he reached his car, he noticed something that made him stop. On the side of the building next to the trees, he saw a van parked. Inside, there were two men staring at him, talking to each other. One of them pointed at him, and the other slowly nodded. Martin felt his heart in his throat. He quickly got into his car and started it, speeding down the road as soon as he could. But as he drove, the feeling of being followed grew. He looked in the rearview mirror, and what he feared was confirmed. The van was following him, its lights barely visible among the trees. Minutes passed and the van stayed at a constant distance, but Martin knew they were stalking him. His heart pounded as he pressed the accelerator, trying to escape. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. Panic started to build. The road seemed endless, and Martin knew that if he didn't find help soon, those men would catch up. As his thoughts raced, the van accelerated, getting dangerously close. Just when he thought they would ram him, another car appeared out of nowhere, coming from the opposite direction. The van braked and slowed down, but Martin took the opportunity to speed up and increase the distance. The other car quickly disappeared, but the men in the van hadn't given up. Martin knew he wasn't safe. He needed to get off that road as soon as possible. In the distance, he saw a sign indicating an exit to the main highway. He floored the accelerator, his only hope being to reach it before the van caught up again. Finally, he reached the highway and quickly turned. The van's lights faded into the distance. Martin sighed in relief, but he still felt like he had barely escaped. He knew he had been marked, and although he had managed to flee, the experience left him deeply unsettled. As he continued on his way, he couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror one last time. The dark stretch of the secondary road was behind him, but the fear he felt didn't disappear so easily. The rain had been relentless for hours, turning the narrow rural roads into slippery ribbons of mud. Adriana squinted through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up with the torrential downpour. She hadn't meant to drive this late, but a wrong turn had taken her deep into the rural roads with no GPS signal and no clear idea of where she was. Panic began to set in just as the fuel gauge needle dropped into the red zone. Suddenly, she spotted a sign through the rain. An old faded neon sign reading Estación Herrera. The old gas station was a beacon in the storm. Its yellowish lights cast long shadows on the wet pavement. Relieved, Adriana turned into the parking lot. The station looked like it had frozen in time. 2 old gas pumps under a tin canopy, and the building itself was a low brick structure with windows too dirty to see through. The place didn't seem inviting, but she had no choice. She needed fuel, and there was nowhere else to go. She stepped out of the car, clutching her jacket against the cold wind and the rain that enveloped her. The sound of the storm seemed to swallow everything else. There were no cars, no people, no sounds beyond the relentless drumming of the rain on the concrete. The pumps were rusty, but when she lifted the nozzle, it felt surprisingly sturdy in her hands. She turned the lever and began to fill the tank. While she waited, Adriana looked toward the gas station office. The door creaked open and a man stepped out, silhouetted by the flickering light inside. He wore a worn work shirt with the name Herrera stitched on the chest, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Adriana could feel him watching her, every movement under his gaze. "Do you need help?" the man growled, his voice rough, carried by the wind and rain. Adriana forced a smile. "I'm just filling up," she said, trying to make her voice sound firm, but it came out small in the empty parking lot. The man didn't respond, just remained in the doorway, unmoving. The rain beat on the tin roof, and for a moment time seemed to stop. Adriana's skin prickled, a feeling of unease crawling up her spine. When the pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full, Adriana quickly put the nozzle back in place and headed to the small office to pay. The man stepped aside as she approached, his presence threatening even though he did nothing. The inside of the gas station was even more unsettling than the outside. The lights flickered, buzzing softly, and the air was heavy, laden with the smell of old oil and dust. The shelves were filled with strange, outdated items, old cans of oil, maps that looked untouched for decades, and snacks with faded labels. Adriana reached the counter and placed her credit card. The man stood on the other side, his long fingers resting on the edge of the counter. His nails were yellowed and cracked. "The card machine doesn't work," the man rasped, his lips curving into a thin smile. "Cash only." Adriana's heart sank. She rummaged in her bag, pulling out some crumpled bills. "Is this enough?" she asked. The man's smile widened as he took the money. "More than enough," he replied. Adriana nodded, anxious to get out of there. She turned to leave, but as she did, something on the wall behind the counter caught her eye. A bulletin board covered in old, yellowed missing persons posters. There were dozens of them, all haphazardly pinned, with the edges curling from age. One of the posters hanging near the bottom made her freeze. It was a photo of a young woman. Not recent, but her face showed signs of someone who had gone missing long ago. The young woman's eyes seemed to plead for help from the yellowing paper. Adriana's heart began to pound in her chest as she stared at the image. Below her photo, the poster read, "Missing since 2019. Last seen near Estación Herrera." Adriana swallowed hard, trying to look away, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Just then, the man stopped moving behind the counter, his face rigid, his eyes colder than before. Suddenly, he leaned slightly toward her, his voice low and threatening. "You're not planning on staying around here too long, are you?" The tone in his voice wasn't a question, it was a warning. The atmosphere grew heavier, and the air in the room seemed to become stifling. Adriana felt her breath quicken. She knew she had to get out of there as soon as possible. No, I'm leaving now," she replied, her voice trembling as she hurried toward the door. The man said nothing more, but as Adriana pushed the door open, she felt a presence closer than it should be. She didn't dare look back as she ran to her car, trembling as she struggled to fit the key into the lock. Finally, she got the door open, slid inside, and slammed it shut, her hands shaking as she started the engine. As the car roared to life and she sped away from the parking lot, a wave of relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. In the rearview mirror, she saw the man slowly walking toward the road. He seemed larger now, more threatening. His hands, huge and bony, hung at his sides as if he was waiting for the perfect moment to move closer. Adriana pressed the accelerator, leaving the gas station behind, but the man's face and the words on the posters remained etched in her mind. Every time she looked in the rearview mirror, she feared seeing him closer, stalking her, waiting for his opportunity. She drove for kilometers, trying not to look back, but the sense that something was deeply wrong at that station wouldn't leave her. She knew that what she had found was something much worse than just an old gas station. It was one of those desolate, winding roads that seemed to stretch into oblivion, flanked by endless fields of dry grass. Camillo had been driving for hours. He wasn't entirely sure where he was. He only knew that the last gas station he had passed was kilometers behind, and the low fuel warning light had been on for a while. His phone had no signal, the sky was ominously dark gray, and a storm was quickly approaching. Up ahead, he saw a structure barely visible through the haze of dust and the distant rumble of thunder. A gas station, old and rundown, but there it was. It looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The sign above it was cracked and flickering, but the pump seemed operational. Camillo sighed with relief and turned into the lot, the crunch of gravel under his tires sounding too loud in the eerie stillness of the place. The station was eerily quiet. The wind howled, whistling through the broken windows of the convenience store. There were no cars, no staff, no sounds apart from the wind and the distant roar of thunder. Camilo stepped out of the car, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. He approached one of the old pumps, its metal rusty and peeling, but it still seemed functional. As he filled the tank, he noticed movement inside the store. A shadow, barely visible through the grime on the windows, but definitely there. He squinted, trying to make out more. Was there someone inside? Camilo decided to check. The nozzle clicked as it stopped, indicating the tank was full. He removed it and walked toward the store. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound unpleasantly loud in the quiet. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with dust and neglect. The shelves were almost empty, except for a few cans of food that looked ancient and a row of chocolate bars covered in dust. The cash register was covered in grime, and an old radio on the counter crackled with static. "Hello?" Camilo called out. His voice seemed too loud in the dead space. There was no response, but he swore he had seen something move inside the store. He took a few cautious steps further in, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The whole place felt wrong, as if he had stepped into a forgotten part of time, abandoned by everyone except something that wasn't quite normal. And then he heard it, a soft whisper. He froze, listening carefully. He heard it again, soft, barely audible, like voices carried by the wind, but it was coming from inside the station. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but he couldn't make out the words. Camilo followed the sound, moving toward the back of the store. The whisper led him to a door, an old and battered one that looked out of place among the other decaying remnants of the building. It was ajar, and the darkness beyond it was thick and impenetrable. The whispers came from behind that door. He reached out for the knob, hesitating. Every instinct inside him screamed for him to leave, to get back to his car and leave that place as fast as possible. But something pulled him forward, something deep and primal, as if the door were calling him. With a trembling hand, Camilo pushed the door open a bit more. The space beyond wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a storage room or an office, it was something entirely different. The walls were made of old wood and the air was colder there, damp with a smell of earth. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he stepped inside, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, surrounding him now. In the center of the room there was a staircase, spiraling down into the darkness. Camilo stared at it, his pulse quickening. Why would there be a staircase in the middle of an old gas station? There was no basement, nothing in the area's plans that suggested such a thing existed. He swallowed, stepping back. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something moved. It was the shadow he had seen earlier, now clearer. It stood at the top of the stairs, a human-like figure but distorted, stretched in a grotesque way, with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles. The whispers intensified as the figure tilted its head unnaturally, watching him. Camilo stumbled back, panic settling into his bones. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, surrounding him from all sides. He could feel its gaze on him, cold as if it had been waiting for him for a very, very long time. The whispers now formed words, twisted and deformed, but clear enough to chill his blood. "Down. Come down." Camilo's feet moved on their own, dragging him toward the staircase. He fought against the urge to go down, his mind screaming at him to run, to leave, but his legs wouldn't obey. Each step took him closer to that darkness, as if the staircase itself was calling him. The darkness around him grew deeper, the air thicker, harder to breathe. Finally, he reached the edge of the staircase, staring into the abyss below, an impenetrable void that seemed to throb with its own life. The whispers were deafening now, pushing him, urging him to descend, to fall into that pit of darkness. Just as he was about to step down, the front door of the station slammed shut, the loud bang snapping him out of his trance. Camilo's heart pounded in his chest as he turned sharply, and to his horror, the shadow was no longer on the stairs. It was behind him. Camilo ran without thinking, just fled from the store, across the lot toward his car. He threw himself inside, started the engine, and sped out of the lot, the wheels skidding on the gravel before gripping the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw that the gas station had vanished. In its place was just an empty, barren field stretching into the distance. There were no signs of the building, no pumps, no lights, just desolate land. Camilo's blood ran cold. He looked ahead, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The rain had started again, harder this time, pounding the windshield. He tried to control his breathing, convincing himself that it had all been a hallucination, that the isolation had played tricks on him. But then from the back seat he heard it, a whisper. "Down." Camilo didn't dare look back in the mirror. It was close to midnight when Mario saw the faint glow of the gas station in the distance. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, eager to fill up and get off that deserted road. The drive had been long, and the endless stretch of nothing between towns had worn on his nerves. It would just be a quick stop at the station, and then he'd be on his way, he told himself. The station was old. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie green light over the cracked pavement. There was only one gas pump, rusty but functional, and the small convenience store was a low square building with a single buzzing light inside. Mario pulled up next to the pump and looked around. There wasn't a soul in sight, just the wind whistling through the empty lot and the creaking of the worn-out station sign. He got out of the car and went to grab the nozzle, but his hand froze when he heard a faint scratching sound. He looked around but saw nothing unusual, just the dimly lit station, the empty road, and the darkness surrounding him. The sound seemed to come from somewhere nearby, metallic and harsh, like something sharp scraping against metal. Mario shook his head and focused on filling up his tank. He needed to move on if he wanted to reach his destination before dawn. As he waited for the tank to fill, the scratching grew louder, more persistent. He looked toward the store where the light inside flickered slightly. Curiosity got the better of him, and against his better judgment, Mario walked toward the door. The main door was slightly ajar and the interior was dimly lit, casting long shadows over the empty shelves. He turned the knob and pushed the door cautiously. The bell above it let out a faint jingle. The store looked as neglected as the outside. Dusty shelves, outdated products, and an old cash register that seemed unused for years. The air smelled of dampness and rusty metal, and the feeling that time had stopped in that place enveloped him. "Hello?" Mario called out, but only silence answered. The whispers hadn't stopped. Now he could hear them more clearly coming from the back of the store, where a door was slightly open, revealing stairs leading down to a basement. The fuel pump had clicked, indicating the tank was full, but Mario's curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he walked toward the back door, the whispering growing louder, the scratches more pronounced. As he approached the door, he saw it, a dark stain on the floor, barely visible under the dim light. At first, he thought it was oil, but as he bent down to inspect it, his stomach churned. It wasn't oil. It was blood. The trail extended across the floor, leading toward that back door that was slightly ajar. The sound of scratching was louder now, coming from below, from the darkness beyond the door. Mario took a step back, every fiber of his being screaming at him to leave. Yet something pulled him forward. He forced himself to open the door a bit wider, revealing a narrow, steep staircase descending into the darkness. At the top of the stairs, Mario hesitated. The scratches came from below, rhythmic and constant. He took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to go down, when suddenly the scratching stopped. Silence. An oppressive silence settled over him like a heavy blanket. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. For a moment, Mario waited at the top of the stairs, his mind torn between the need to flee and the growing feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Then, the scratching began again, louder, sharper. Against his better judgment, Mario descended the first few steps, trying to see what was down in that basement. The space was small, damp, and smelled of mold. Only a few faint rays of light reached down there, cast by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering with a yellowish glow. In one corner, a large tarp covered something, and on the floor, he saw dark stains spreading toward it. The scratches returned, closer this time. Mario couldn't see where they were coming from, but the sound surrounded him, echoing in the small space. He moved toward the tarp, his heart racing. He reached out for the edge of the tarp, feeling a knot in his stomach, like an invisible cord tightening with every passing second. Just as he was about to lift it, the sound stopped again, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a loud bang, filling the room with the echo of wood hitting wood. Mario jumped, his heart pounding as the bulb flickered violently. The sound of breathing began to echo just behind him, soft and slow, almost like a whisper. He turned quickly but couldn't see anything in the dim light. He tried to move toward the stairs, but the feeling that something was approaching kept him frozen in place. A light touch, like something brushing against his back. Finally, without thinking any further, Mario sprinted up the stairs. He rushed, stumbling over the steps, nearly falling as he scrambled to reach the door. His trembling hands grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, hearing a soft, guttural laugh growing closer from the darkness behind him. Suddenly, the door swung open, almost knocking him off his feet. He quickly got up and ran to his car, not looking back, his heart pounding in his ears. He jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, leaving the pump in place as he sped out of the parking lot. The car shot down the road, the tires screeching as he sped away. In the rear-view mirror, he saw the station, but now there was something else at the door, a motionless figure watching him. It was too tall, too distorted to be human. Mario's eyes fixed on the road, his mind racing. What he had seen in that basement, what he had heard, was not something that should exist. But as the kilometers stretched out before him, something even more disturbing hit him. The fuel gauge was still in the red. Despite having filled the tank, the needle hadn't moved a millimeter. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Camila saw the dim lights of a gas station flickering in the distance. She sighed with relief. Her nerves were frayed after driving for hours on winding, empty roads. The fuel gauge had been blinking red for a while, and her phone's GPS had stopped working over an hour ago. She hadn't seen another car, house, or sign of life for kilometers. As she approached the station, she realized it looked much older and more run down than she had anticipated. The sign above the pumps read, "Whispering Pines Gas," although half the letters were burned out or barely legible. The paint was peeling off the walls of the small store, and the few lights that were on flickered intermittently, casting a dim and unsteady glow. There was only one old pump under a rusty canopy, and the night felt unnaturally still. Camila parked next to the pump and stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at her skin. The silence was oppressive. There were no sounds except for the low hum of the flickering lights above her. She grabbed the nozzle and lifted it to fill the tank, but before she could begin, she heard a creak behind her that made her stop. She turned slowly, expecting to see someone coming out of the store, but there was no one. The door had opened on its own, creaking slowly. Camila stood frozen for a second, staring at the open door, waiting for someone to come out. Nothing. She hesitated, but then told herself it was probably just the wind. However, there was no wind that night. She turned back to the pump and started to fill the tank, occasionally glancing toward the open door of the store. The tank filled quickly, and just as she was about to replace the nozzle, an eerie feeling washed over her, as if she were being watched. Instinctively, she looked back at the store again. The windows were dark, but out of the corner of her eye, she could see something moving inside, shadows sliding behind the glass. A chill ran down her spine. She told herself that someone must be there, maybe the store attendant, even though she hadn't seen anyone step out. She finished filling the tank and decided it would be wise to go inside to pay and maybe grab something to eat. As she walked toward the door, the echo of her footsteps resonated in the unsettling quiet of the night. She pushed the door, which creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the place was in worse condition than she had imagined. The shelves were half empty, covered in dust, as if no one had restocked in years. The lights flickered and buzzed, casting long shadows across the store's floor. The air smelled of dampness, mold, and something else, something stale and sickly sweet. "Hello?" Camila called out, her voice sounding too loud in the empty space. There was no answer. She moved further into the store, her eyes scanning every corner for any movement. There was a cash register on the counter, but no one stood behind it. As she inspected the place, her gaze shifted toward a door at the back of the store, marked with a sign indicating the bathrooms. The door was slightly ajar, and from there a shadow seemed to move, as if someone were hiding. Camila's heart started to race. Instinctively, she took a step back. Then she heard a soft noise, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from the back of the store. She quickly turned around, her heart pounding. Again, she saw no one, just the dust-covered shelves and the buzz of the lights. But something wasn't right. That feeling of being watched persisted. Camila took a step toward the exit, but then she heard a loud noise behind the bathroom door, the squeak of hinges and quiet, stealthy footsteps. Panic set in. She wanted to run, but something held her back. The shadows she had seen earlier were not just illusions. There were people inside, lurking. Suddenly, the bathroom door swung open, and she saw a tall, burly figure moving quickly. Instinctively, she turned on her heels and ran toward the main door. She pushed the door hard, almost falling in her haste to escape. She threw herself into her car, trembling as she struggled to unlock the driver's side door. Once inside, she locked the doors, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The car roared to life, and Camilla floored the accelerator, speeding out of the parking lot, away from the gas station as fast as she could. As she drove, her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see the store fading into the distance. But what she saw left her frozen. In the mirror, she saw a man standing in the doorway of the store, watching her. He wore a cap pulled low over his face, and although she couldn't see his eyes, she knew he was staring right at her. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, more figures began to emerge from the store, all dressed similarly, moving quickly toward the road. Camilla felt her stomach drop, and she pressed the pedal harder, the car roaring as she sped away from the station. But as she did, the sense of dread wouldn't leave her. Something was wrong. There was something she hadn't noticed until now. She glanced at her fuel gauge and her blood ran cold. Despite filling the tank completely, the needle still indicated empty. Fear gripped her, her breathing quickened. She looked one last time at the rearview mirror and saw the men stepping onto the road as if they were following her. But deep down, she knew she hadn't escaped. And then from the trees flanking the road just beyond the reach of her headlights, she saw something move. Something larger, something that seemed to be lurking in the darkness. Terror flooded her as she pressed the accelerator even harder, knowing that no matter how far she went, she couldn't outrun those who were following her. Daniel had been driving on secondary roads for hours, lost somewhere in the dense rural forests. His GPS had stopped working a while ago, and every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the middle of nowhere. Past midnight, the darkness was as dense as the forest surrounding him, with the trees closing in as if swallowing him up. The fuel gauge on his car was dangerously close to empty, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of that desolate landscape without phone service filled him with panic. Just when he was about to lose hope, his headlights illuminated a sign on the side of the road. Ultima Parada Gasolinera. Daniel felt a surge of relief. A little further ahead was the gas station. The sign flickered weakly with worn-out letters and dim lights barely illuminating the way. The station looked like it was from another era, a small wooden building with peeling paint and only one rusty pump. The lights inside the building flickered intermittently, casting shadows that moved strangely in the night. The place seemed abandoned, but it was open. Daniel parked next to the pump and got out of the car. The cold night air bit at his skin, and everything was eerily silent. There was no wind, no insect noises, not even the creaking of branches in the forest. Just him and the emptiness. He approached the pump, an old relic that seemed forgotten by time. He tried to activate it, but it required a manual start. He leaned down to adjust it, and as he did, something in the window of the store caught his attention. A figure, barely visible behind the dirty glass, but someone was definitely there, watching him. Daniel's heart stopped for a moment. He hadn't seen anyone when he arrived, and the sudden appearance of the figure took him by surprise. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat with his face hidden in the shadows. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. Against his better instincts, he finished adjusting the pump and started filling the tank, constantly glancing at the window. The man remained there, motionless, watching him. When the tank was full, Daniel put the nozzle back and decided he needed to pay. He walked toward the store door, though each step felt heavier than the last, as if something invisible was holding him back. He opened the door and the faint chime of the bell echoed. The inside of the store was even worse than the outside. The shelves were covered in dust and almost empty. The few products left were old and faded. The light flickered intermittently, casting shadows that made the place seem even more threatening. Behind the counter stood the man. Now Daniel could see him more clearly, but something about him was off. He was rigid, motionless, with his face still hidden under the shadow of his hat and coat. He didn't move or speak. He just stared at Daniel from the other side of the counter. Daniel tried to keep calm and approached, forcing a smile. I just filled the tank. How much do I owe?" The man didn't respond. His face remained hidden under the shadow of the hat. His unmoving posture was deeply unsettling. Daniel felt his nerves begin to fray. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man slowly raised his hand and pointed toward a small door at the back of the store. Daniel hadn't noticed it before. It was an old wooden door, worn and weathered, which looked much older than the rest of the station. It was slightly open and the darkness beyond was deep and impenetrable. Daniel felt the blood run cold in his veins. He didn't understand why, but something about that door filled him with a deep terror. "I just want to pay for the gas," he said, his voice cracking a little. The man didn't respond. He continued pointing at the door. Then Daniel heard something, a whisper, soft and distant like a voice calling him from beyond the door. He slowly turned toward the door. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent, but it didn't come from the man. It came from the darkness beyond the door. Daniel froze. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet began moving toward the door as if something was pushing him. Every fiber of his being told him not to open that door, but he couldn't stop himself. His trembling hand rose and pushed the door open a little further. The darkness on the other side was absolute, and an unnatural cold emanated from it, accompanied by a faint but unmistakable smell of rot. He stepped closer to the threshold, his breath catching in his throat. Something moved within the darkness. He couldn't see it clearly, but he sensed it. Boxes, ropes, and a corner filled with blood-stained objects. Then he understood. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, there was a loud bang behind him. The man had closed the main door of the store. Daniel turned sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. The man was walking slowly toward him, and in his other hand, he held something Daniel hadn't noticed before. A rope. Daniel backed up toward the door of the store, tripping over objects on the floor. Terror gripped him as he realized what was happening. The man was trying to trap him. The shadows in the store seemed to close in around him, as if the entire place was part of the trap. Without thinking any further, Daniel ran toward the main door, pushing it open with all his strength. He sprinted to his car, his hands shaking as he struggled to start the engine. The car roared to life, and Daniel sped out of the lot, leaving the pump behind as he accelerated away. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man standing in the store's doorway, calmly watching him. And behind him, in the darkness of the store, he could see the outlines of the other objects he had been moving. Daniel pressed the accelerator hard, not looking back. He drove as fast as he could, his eyes fixed on the dark, winding road ahead. When he finally felt far enough, he dared to breathe a little easier. But something even more terrifying awaited him. The fuel gauge needle hadn't moved. It still read empty. He glanced once more at the rearview mirror and his heart stopped. In the middle of the road, right in front of him, there was a tall figure dressed in black staring at him. Daniel jerked the wheel, barely managing to avoid it. His heart pounded, and when he dared to look in the mirror again, the road behind him was empty. But the echo of danger still resonated in his mind, knowing he had barely escaped a mortal threat. I had been driving for hours when the low fuel warning light on my car's dashboard came on. The clock read midnight, and the road stretched endlessly in front of me, dark and empty. The GPS indicated that the nearest gas station was about 26 kilometers away. So, with no other option, I took an exit that led me down a narrow and winding path. The night was eerily quiet. I hadn't seen a single car for kilometers. The dense forest flanked both sides of the road, with shadows dancing menacingly in my peripheral vision. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, hoping the gas station would appear soon. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the faint glow of a sign in the distance. Bill's Gas and Service. The gas station was small, isolated, and seemed like it hadn't been updated in decades. Only one of the 3 pumps appeared to be operational, and the flickering light above it gave the place an eerie, almost abandoned atmosphere. But I was desperate, and the needle on the fuel gauge was dangerously close to hitting the bottom. I turned into the station and parked beside the pump, shutting off the engine. As I stepped out of the car, a gust of cold wind hit me, and the feeling of desolation intensified. The sound of the trees made me feel as if someone was watching me from the thicket. I looked around, noticing there was no attendant in sight, even though the light inside the small station store was on. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door, hoping I could pay there. The door opened with a creak as soon as I touched it. I paused for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. Something felt off, but the need to refuel pushed me forward. The air inside the store was heavy and dense. The shelves were covered in dust, filled with old snacks and drinks that looked like they had been there for years. Behind the counter, an older man sat in a chair, his face hidden behind a newspaper. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "I need to fill up the tank." The man didn't respond. The newspaper rustled slightly, but he didn't look up. I moved a little closer, the air felt stifling. "Is anyone working here?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound firmer. Slowly, the man lowered the newspaper, and I almost stepped back when I saw his face. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes, sunken deep into his skull, were unnaturally wide, bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak. He just stared at me with an expression that sent a wave of discomfort through my entire body. "I just need a bit of gas," I repeated, trying to stay calm. Without a word, the man pointed at an old cash register on the counter. I understood he wanted me to pay in cash. I pulled a few crumpled bills out of my pocket, eager to finish up and get out of there. As I handed him the money, his cold, clammy hand brushed against mine, making me shiver. I felt something was wrong and wanted to run out. "Thank you," I muttered, turning quickly and heading straight for the door. Just as my hand touched the handle, the man's raspy voice stopped me. "You shouldn't be out this late." I slowly turned, my heart pounding. "What?" The man stared at me, his eyes even wider, his dry lips curling into a faint smile. "It's dangerous to be on these roads after midnight," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur. A chill ran down my spine. "Well, I'll be on my way soon," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, though every part of me was screaming to get out of there as quickly as possible. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cold of the night hitting me hard. I hurried back to the pump to fill up the tank, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. The wind had stopped and the night was completely silent. Not a single sound, not even a whisper of wind. Just my breathing, heavy and uneven. As I finished filling the tank, I heard a loud thud coming from the forest behind the gas station. I froze in place, my hand still on the pump nozzle, my heart racing in my chest. The thud repeated, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching. I looked toward the forest, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the station's lights. I tried telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound of those footsteps was different. It was more human but heavy, and then the footsteps stopped. For a moment the silence returned, and I began to breathe more calmly. Then all of a sudden a figure emerged from the trees, barely visible under the dim light, but clear enough to make my heart stop. It was a man, tall and bulky, with worn, dirty clothes and an expression of rage on his face. I stood there, frozen, my legs refusing to move. The man tilted his head to the side, and at that moment his eyes locked onto mine. There was no doubt he wasn't there by coincidence. With a determined movement, the man started walking toward me, each step quicker than the last. His large, calloused hands moved as if he were ready to lunge at me. I dropped the pump nozzle, my hands trembling violently. I backed up, stumbling toward my car as panic consumed me. I barely managed to open the door and threw myself inside, my hands shaking as I struggled to insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the man lunged at me, his hands grazing the side of the car. I slammed the accelerator, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing in the middle of the road. His eyes locked on me as I drove away. I didn't stop the car until I was several kilometers away, my heart still pounding, my hands gripping the wheel. I tried convincing myself that it was just a coincidence, that the man was simply in the wrong place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped.